Today, 21% of adults in the U.S. are illiterate, and more than half of American adults read below a sixth grade level.
They teach preschool, and they were talking about how the kids literally can't do anything. Like, they can't hold a pencil for long periods of time. They can't play with Play-Doh. They can't color. They can't spray a spritz bottle. And my Roman Empire is the connection between physical development through play and academics.
I think without the Department of Ed, there's a lot of America, especially rural America, where kids aren't really going to have a chance to break out of poverty. Title I is one of the things that this Department of Education administers, and they level the playing field. I have seen it with children, and I am very, very angry about this.
I've been retired a few years. I can't imagine the trauma and the stress I would be. We teachers live paycheck to paycheck, and just be told tomorrow, the funding is cut off. How does the community deal with suddenly, a lot of teachers that are not able to support their families?
I'm concerned about school lunches. I believe that every child should be able to eat healthy and filling food throughout the day. If school lunch programs
that is going through Title I, through IDEA programs.
What's that stand for?
Do you know what? I'm not sure I can tell you exactly what it stands for, except that it's the programs for disabled and needs.
Individuals with Disabilities Act, I think. Yeah. I'm guessing. I don't know. I don't know all my acronyms. I've been here for 30 years.
This is my fifth day on the job.
Hey, hello, everybody. It's your girl Maya here. Thank you so much for tuning into the Theology Podcast today. We have a topic today that is near and dear to my heart, and that is education. Listen, you saw by the intro, we have a crisis in education right now. A lot of different people talking about different issues. A lot of people have different solutions, and today we're going to really dig into how we got here and hopefully come up with solutions on how to best move from there. Listen, we know across this country, literacy rates among both children and adults are plummeting. The United States is ranked ridiculously low in comparison to other developed nations across the world when it comes to education. Parents, I would know because I'm one of them, are inundated with the pressure not to ruin your kids by sending them to the wrong school. There is this air of educational elitism throughout our country, and there is an existential pressure to send your kids to the right school. And our current administration sees all of these problems in education and just says, hey, let's go ahead and just close the whole thing. Let's go ahead and just shut down the entire Department of Education, and let's just return all education legislation back to the states. And the whole states' rights thing, it sounds very slavery, very Civil War, very 1800s, very splitting of the Union, very Confederacy. And, I don't like it. Yuck. Ew. Now, before we get into the research today, and I'm going to let you know there's a lot of it, so this might have to be a two-part episode. I want to give you a little bit of my background and just kind of let you into my why of why I'm passionate about public education, and also let you know how I'm approaching this topic, because I feel in addition to my research, I'm bringing a very balanced point of view and life experience to this topic. So I'm going to take it back and just let you in on a little bit of my lore here. So growing up, my mom was not playing about education, about reading. My mother has a degree in library science, and I remember having a lot of books in my house. I had multiple diaries. I was encouraged to write and read a lot. And me and my mama, I'm 30 years old, we are still basically in a book club together to this day. We're always talking about the books we're reading. We share a friggin' Libby account. We locked in for real, okay? Growing up from kindergarten to 8th grade, I went to a private Christian school, and that school was connected to our church. So that means that I had to grow up very sanctified because my mama was on campus, okay? So I couldn't play around, all right? And I learned so much at that school. A lot of my faith education and spiritual formation happened at that school, but also a lot of my Black history education happened at that school as well. My entire student population was Black. All my teachers were Black. We had Black history programs with praise dancers, so that's the kind of environment I grew up in. Very godly, very Black. And now you see how I am now. After that experience, I go on to high school, and this is my first time going to a public school when I entered ninth grade, and I had a great experience there, a great education there. Our high school in particular was a very diverse environment. My high school, basically with demographics, was split into thirds. So we had 33% white, 33% black, 33% Hispanic kids, and we had kids who lived in the country club, and we had kids who were in multi-generational family homes. It was a very diverse population. And this was also like the first opportunity that I had to have community with people who were outside of my faith practice, which was really good for me. And it kind of taught me like how to talk about the things that I believe, because when I was in a private school, everybody just believed how I believe. So it kind of gave me a little bit of boldness, and now you see how I am now. I also had my very first like real boyfriend, which I don't know if you can count that as a growth experience. I definitely learned something, but anywho, I got to explore a lot more options for the arts actually at my public school, because my private school that I grew up in just didn't have the research to sustain a lot of arts education. So I was involved in the band, I was involved with theater. I got to take IB and AP classes, which was able to get me some college credit. Hallelujah. And I met some of my favorite teachers at that school, and I'm still Facebook friends with a lot of them to this day. After college, I actually went on to teach in the public schools for 5 years. I got my degree in early childhood education, magna cum laude, don't play with me. And I absolutely loved my job. I taught language arts and history, and I felt called to it, and I felt a personal responsibility and a deep love for my kiddos, and I loved opening books for them. I loved opening the world of literature for them and showing them how to connect to reading and to books. And even though some of the stress from the job was, around behavior of my kids, I will say that the biggest stress from my occupation was about all the red tape that I had to get through just to teach. There are so many politics related to being an educator, a code, certain words you can say and cannot say, people that you don't piss off. And it's exhausting to just try to navigate all of that some days. I just wanted to teach, and it seemed like there was always something new that we had to adjust to. On top of that, I was teaching at a Title I school, which means that the students that we served were experiencing poverty, and therefore a lot of kids were low performing. Note that I said low performing, not stupid, because I had some of the most intelligent children in my classroom. They just weren't good test takers. And we'll get to that. But because of that performance gap, my district was constantly trying new reforms, new magic pills, and new strategies to get the kids to perform well on our standardized tests. And there were always whispers of the schools that failed our standardized testing. There was always gossip and tea about the schools that did well and the schools that did not. And there was a stigma that I still struggle with about labeling schools, because I know that that number has so much more to it. I know that behind the score, there are students and teachers, people, image bearers, and they're behind those scores. And a lot of them were just trying their best. I ended up leaving the classroom in 2020, which I really can't talk about why I left, because I had to sign an NDA. But then I went on to work for an educational technology company for about 4 years, which they let me go about a month ago, and I had to sign an NDA. I had to sign an NDA for them too. But when I worked at that job, I learned a lot about the business side of education, and how a lot of companies and marketing firms who have no education background, by the way, are basically exploiting public education's need for a quick fix for low scores. And a lot of times they develop programs that are supposed to just fix these kids in a calendar year. And that job, even though it provided for me and let me stay home with my children in their early years, our mission and our goals kind of made me sick to my stomach some days. And now I'm unemployed. And I'm homeschooling, not because I'm like super strict, but because preschool and daycare are expensive, and I have a teaching degree, so why not use it? All of that experience, private school, public school, teaching in public education, working on the big business side of education, and now homeschooling my kiddos, all of that experience has led me here to this research and why I'm so passionate about it. And it's led me to ask the questions, are the kids okay? Should we open the schools? Which schools are we closing and why? And most importantly, how do we love the children that the system is leaving behind? So a lot of times people like to tie all of our social problems to the schools. So this is an easy blame game when we see the generation coming up behind us saying stupid things or posting stupid things. We automatically look to the institution that is supposed to be educating them. The fact of the matter is that schools cannot solve all social problems. Schools are one part of a larger society and community, and our schools are necessary for our democratic communities and systems, but they cannot always be the scapegoat for when society is failing. And because schools are always used as a reason for why everything sucks, there are people always trying to fix said problem. Every political campaign, presidential administration, or billionaire turned philanthropist always tries to take the mantle to reform the public education system. And this approach pulls on heartstrings because our children are precious to us. People send their children to school for 8 hours a day, and when they come home, they want to know that their children are protected and safe and that they're learning. And when parents don't see those results either individually or they receive messaging that schools are failing, a man with a microphone who says that they're going to save the schools, that sounds pretty good, but in reality, there are no shortcuts to fixing public education. It will have to be an ongoing, consistent improvement. But if each administration comes up with a new idea every 4 years, we can never stay the course to see real improvement. Our new administration's cry is to just defund the Department of Education. And a lot of people agree with this. They think the schools are not doing well, they're not performing, literacy is declining, schools are wasting our tax dollars. Let's defund the whole thing. Isn't it crazy how you all say that when an entity that is supposed to be serving the public isn't doing that, their funds should be reallocated and removed? I feel like we might have said that about another public service, but just can't quite put my finger on it. Anyway, now let's discuss what that really means. Defunding the Department of Education essentially means decentralization. Decentralization is the transfer of control of an activity or organization to several local offices or authorities instead of at one single one. So what this would look like in education is basically instead of there being a national department that monitors education legislation and how money is distributed, instead local states would control their own education initiatives, legislation, and funding. Hence, we have the states' rights comparisons from the Civil War. This would be a nightmare situation for states with smaller GDP. What that means is that states that don't make a lot of money because they don't have a lot of economic output, it would be very hard for them to sustain their own state's Department of Education. Now, when we have all of our states, all 50 states paying into the federal government through taxes, all of those resources pool into the Department of Education among other government departments. Smaller states with less resources benefit from that because they're able to benefit from the whole pool of resources. That funding goes to their buildings, transportation, hiring teachers, and larger states who have larger economic output like New York, California, they can afford to run on their own because their states make so much money. But states that don't have a lot of economic output, they would struggle. So let's talk about what would be some of the things that would happen if the Department of Education decides to decentralize or shut down. A lot of the policies and the legislation at the federal level would be at risk. So we have laws like the Individual with Disabilities in Education Act, the IDEA Act. This act ensures that students with disabilities receive the support they need. And without federal oversight, there could be inconsistency across states and protections from state to states for students may be weakened. The Department of Education provides significant funding to ensure students with disabilities receive accommodations. And these programs are essential so that students are able to enter into school and be able to participate with the general public. Without this funding, many schools would struggle to provide those services for those students, and it would lead to decreased opportunities and a potential rights violation for those individuals. In addition, if every state runs their own education department, each state's legislation could be different. So that means that the protection for students from state to state could differ. In one state, the protection could be really great and rigorous. And then if that family decides to move, the protections in that next state may be non-existent. So without that federal funding, state and local governments would be kind of forced to take on the entire responsibility for funding education. And a large part of the education budget is to support our kiddos with disabilities, our kiddos who are coming from low income environments. And that funding kind of helps to level the playing field for those kids. But if the department is defunded, those areas that serve those students or those areas that are low income would be hit the hardest. And understand that's not just urban areas, that's rural areas as well. Also, we have to understand that Department of Education stretches past just K through 12. It also goes into higher education. So the Department of Ed plays a role in those federal student loan and grant programs. I am a recipient of one of those grants. Shout out to y'all because y'all helped me pay for my college. So things like the Pell Grants, FAFSA, student financial aid, student loan forgiveness programs, those things. These are all things that help college be more affordable for more students. And if the department is defunded, it would likely lead to a lot of cuts for these financial aid programs. It makes education less accessible for millions of students who already have a student loan debt crisis in this country, and cutting these financial aid programs is only going to exacerbate that problem. Now, these are just a few reasons, but there's a lot of reasons that I hadn't even talked about why defunding the Department of Education is not a good idea. But a radical statement like that sounds good for a persisting problem. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Our school systems are struggling, and many other administrations have tried to solve the problem as well. Please understand that education reform is not just a Republican mantle, and this is not the first time that we've said defund the Department of Education. It's been said before. Both political parties are guilty of using our students as a rallying cry, and a lot of these same politicians that cry for school choice and school reform and different education policy, they have ties and they profit from these reforms and lobby movements. So even though this is a hot button issue and it's a talking point right now, we did not just get here overnight. Y'all know me, I am a context girly, so let's take it back to the 1960s and 70s. This is a turning point in the culture of our country. We have social movements, we have second wave feminism, we have civil rights movement, we have student protests, we have counterculture, and this challenges traditional norms and specifically even traditional educational structures and priorities, and it leads to significant shifts in how Americans see education. We actually see a rise of the unschooling movement during this time, which I think we're seeing a resurgence of the unschooling movement as well. And this promotes learner-directed education and a rejection of formalized schooling. And as a result, this trend kind of results in concerns about the declining academic standard in this country. And in the early 1980s, a report comes out called A Nation at Risk. And y'all, this report was definitely the scandal of its day. And it talked about how there was a crisis in U.S. education, that there was failing academic performance, that students were disengaged, and that they were not being prepared for the workforce. And this sparked basically a renewed focus on educational reform and an importance on rigorous standardized learning. So obviously this became a point of contention for our educators, but not only that, politicians start to get a hold of it. And y'all know when a politician gets their hands on something, they manhandle it. Politicians start to run on the issue of education, and we have the first Bush, George H.W. Bush. He takes office in 1989. And one of the first things he does is he sets some education goals for the year 2000. And I want to read some of these goals to you, and you just tell me what you think. Here they go. All children will start school ready to learn. 90% of students will graduate from high school. All adults will be literate and prepared to compete in the global economy, and every school will be free of drugs, alcohol, and violence. Well, obviously, he did not succeed in these goals, but no worries. His son took up the mantle, and in 2002, the infamous No Child Left Behind Act is signed into law by George W. Bush. Now, the bill is passed with overwhelming support from both sides because in the wake of the 9/11 tragedy, Congress wants to seem unified and nobody wants to seem like the bad guy right now. Literally, if you disagree with the president, you're a terrorist.
Don't say that.
No Child Left Behind basically begins the crusade of judging schools based off of test scores. And all of us remember how we had to, color in those bubbles. Yeah, that was all George Bush. You can thank him for that. Now let's talk about some of the things that No Child Left Behind requires. So No Child Left Behind requires that all public schools that receive federal funding are required to test students in grades 3 through 8 every year and once in high school. Scores needed to be separated by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and disability status. The second requirement is that all states had to show how they would get 100% of their students to proficiency, remember that word, by 2014. The third requirement is that all districts were required to show their AYP, which is adequate yearly progress, to show how they would reach this 100% proficiency. Now let's stop right there. If we're honest, both of these goals already unreachable. With God, all things are possible, but this, absolutely not. Literally, as humanity, we can't 100% anything, not even adults. So expecting our kids to get to this is unreasonable. One of the last requirements of the No Child Left Behind Act is that if a school did not make progress, they were labeled as an improvement school. It would also sometimes be called a SINI school, school in need of improvement. And basically those schools would face a number of punishments or sanctions each year. This ranged from staffing changes, required transfer options, longer school days, and then after 5 years, the school would either have to restructure, they would have to turn into a charter school or be privatized. We'll talk about that in a second. They would have to replace all of their staff, teachers, principals, paras, or they would have to give complete control of the school to a government entity. Now, the biggest problem with No Child Left Behind is that it requires schools to be proficient. Proficient is a vague measurement. It's a made-up word. Even though it requires this proficiency, there is no curriculum. Curriculum is what students should be proficient in. But every state defines what proficiency is. Each state has a definition of proficiency. Y'all want to be decentralized so bad. We already are. There was a required result, of proficiency, but there is no required national curriculum. Every state, hear me, every state in this country has a different curriculum, different standards, and different testing methods, That means that in this country, there are 50 different definitions of what a proficient or good student is. Are we okay? This is also how so many of these education businesses and startups, this is how they make money, because every state needs a curriculum now and a testing module now. And companies realize this and they exploit that need. And now school districts are paying millions of dollars for curriculum and testing. But if we had national standards, national curriculum, and a national testing module, that money could be spent elsewhere, like free lunch or supporting kids with learning disabilities, or having a base competitive salary for teachers all around this country. But instead, districts are spending their tax dollars, your tax dollars, on AI-generated tests and lessons. Doge. Here's the wasteful spending. I found it. Holler at me, bro. Send me a check. Now, also to note here, No Child Left Behind only requires proficiency in math and reading. So subjects like history, science, the arts, humanities, forget about that. We can't measure those things. So kick him out of the door. This is why some of us are so dense now, because some of y'all just never had to observe a painting or listen to a piece of classical music or struggle through how to sight read. Some of y'all don't know that the mitochondria is a powerhouse of the cell. And that's why you act like that, Now teachers spend so much more time on test prep instead of these other humanities, arts education. The focus becomes teaching to the test, passing the test. It's not about teaching and learning anymore. If the test scores are higher than that, means kids are getting a good education, but testing is not the only indicator of a quality school or a quality education. Being a good test taker doesn't mean that you're a well-rounded human or that you will be a lifelong learner. And if anything, this hyper focus on testing makes kids hate school. It makes them hate learning. It makes them hate reading. So it begs the question, why don't we have a national standard? Why don't we have a national curriculum? Why don't all American kids learn the same thing, take the same test? That's what other developed nations do. Well, yeah, that would make sense, right? It would. Absolutely it would. But you know what confuses everything? Racism. Racism. Y'all always be like, is it always about that? Yes. Unfortunately. Yes. Yes. This country was built on a caste system. So yes, we did not want to teach honest history. So if we go back to the space between the first Bush presidency and Bill Clinton, there was a movement to draft nationwide standards. It was led by historians and scientists and educators, but it became a political debate, specifically about the history standards and how the darker parts of our history as a nation should be taught. Specifically talking about the fact that our founding fathers were slave owners, and we just wouldn't want to push their wigs back. So to completely avoid controversy, that work was abandoned, and the work of developing standards and curriculum was sent back to the states. See, we're already decentralized, like I said. And then when it got to the state level, to avoid the controversy locally, the standards became very vague. They never referred to specific historical happenings or figures or even specific texts. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of those vague standards. This is a Georgia history standard. Students will understand the principles of American democracy. What principles? What are we supposed to be teaching about? Are we talking about separation of powers? Are we talking about checks and balances? Because what are those in 2025? Like, are we talking about individual rights? How are students going to demonstrate their understanding? Here's another one in Texas. Students will understand the role of the United States in global affairs. What affairs are we talking about? We're talking about the ones that made us look like the superhero or the ones that made us look like a villain? Which ones are we talking about? Too open-ended. Florida, here's another one. Students will recognize the importance of American history and its impact on the world. Impact is an interesting word. What impact? What are we talking about here? See how vague these are? They leave so much room for interpretation, a lot of room for error. They don't give clear guidance to teachers on what exactly they're supposed to be teaching or assessing. It's just a mess, okay? And one of the reasons also why they're so vague is that a lot of the standards are there to kind of help teachers focus on teaching strategy, not so much content. But knowing strategy is not the same as comprehending material. Okay, so now we have, again, 50, I don't know which way my camera is flipped, but 50 different definitions of proficiency across this country. And every state is trying to make the grade. Remember, No Child Left Behind has now made testing and accountability the culture in education. That's the name of the game. Either you get good test scores or you lose your funding. And the focus now has become higher test scores, not whether or not we are creating knowledgeable children. Now you may ask the question, well, Maya, don't we need testing? Is testing good or bad? Like, how will we assess kids? Yes, hear me. We do need testing, but high stakes testing is where we create unnecessary damage. Testing can be a guide on how schools can get better, but it should not be a gavel or a guillotine if schools do not perform well. Here is why tests don't work. Tests have a huge margin of error. If we are putting all of our stakes on one test each year, there are so many things that can go wrong with it. Tests can be influenced by so many different things: student disposition, the weather, their home life. It's an unfair measure of skill, and it doesn't take into account any of the improvement that might have been made throughout the year. Yes, maybe they scored developing, but at the beginning of the year, they were struggling. Because testing is so important, you have administrators and districts now trying to game the system. Remember, now the focus is not teaching and learning, it's passing the test. So now administrators, school systems are trying to figure out how to rig the system, the great American game, so that test scores work out in their favor. A couple ways that this is done. We see outright cheating. Okay, this is where, we see administrators, teachers either giving out answers or changing answers. Number two, we have lowering the passing score. So maybe in 2024, you needed a 70% to pass, but this year we're going to knock it down to 65%. And look, more kids passed this year, but guess what? The metric was different. Number three, you manipulate the student population. little Johnny, who's always causing a disruption, we're going to suspend him the week before testing so that we don't even have those problems. And we knew he probably wasn't going to score high anyway because he's a behavior problem. Get him out of here. Number 4, increasing accommodations for students that don't need it. We have kids who are reading on grade level, but we're just going to go ahead and let the test be read to them because maybe that might help them to score a little bit higher. Also, we have teachers now spending a lot of time on test prep. They're no longer teaching their content, they're teaching test taking methods. So eliminate the wrong answers. Here's a strategy. You see how the shift in focus now. Forget if these kids are actually learning. Are they proficient? No one thinks if these methods are good or if they're even ethical, because if the scores come out after testing season and the scores are high, nobody bats an eye. We did it, Joe. We did it. Nobody thinks twice. Is this hurting our kids? And a big problem with the high stakes testing is that it gives no responsibility to students and families. If a child does not do well on a standardized test, everyone turns to the teacher in the school and points a finger. No one asks the parent, hey, was your kid coming to school regularly? Do you have a home life that is conducive and supports learning? It's all the school's fault if the kid is messed up. And I used to say this to my parents all the time. This just became my baby, but they've been your baby since day one. And you know your child better than I do. I just joined the village. I just arrived.
Is it coming? I just arrived.
I need your support in order for us to work together so that your child can thrive. But now there is a hyper focus not only on testing, but now those test scores are tied to the teacher. Now we have the philosophy of an effective or good teacher. And because of No Child Left Behind, a good teacher is not one that has a good rapport with their students or is professional or is well educated. A good teacher is just one with good test scores. There's no other measurement. If teachers are the sole key to student achievement, then government officials don't have to do anything in order to improve the way of life of students. That means they don't have to pass any legislation about housing, about poverty, about gun violence, because it's all up to the teacher to lift those kids out of poverty. And I'm starting to realize that Freedom Riders was just propaganda, because there's no way. There's so many factors that go into if a student is successful. And yes, teachers have a huge responsibility and impact, but they're just one piece of the puzzle. And because they accrue so much pressure, they're micromanaged, they're undermined. And it's honestly why we see so much turnover in this profession, because they're not treated like professionals. So many districts try to meet the challenge of higher test scores, and a lot of these experiments pop up in lower performing districts in the hood. People with lots of money and political power show up on the white horse, they show up on the block, and they're there to save the district. Everybody want to be Morgan Freeman and lean on me. So remember, y'all, curriculum, what kids should know. Because of politics and racism and adults just not getting along, curriculum is very vague and it differs state to state. But all the kids across the country try to have to make the grade. They have a high score that they're trying to get, but they don't have a roadmap, no curriculum, no plan to get there. Here is where the saviorism comes in. We see this new movement of what we call reformed curriculum. So we see things like balanced literacy. This is where we shift from phonics instruction to reading strategy. So instead of teaching kids A says A, B says B, it's let's look at the picture and try to infer what the word says. You see how that's a problem? Then we have constructivist math. So we have less about numeracy and place value and problem solving, and it's more about student-led models and interpretation. This is why some of y'all get so frustrated with your baby's math homework, because your baby says, no, I have to draw the blocks, I have to draw the circles, I have to draw the model. That's what that constructivist math is, okay? That's why y'all get so frustrated, okay? Now, these new changes in curriculum were adopted by a lot of struggling districts, okay? Because they promised a high payout and schools are desperate. Remember, No Child Left Behind says either you make the grade or we take your funding. So principals and district officials are literally just grasping for straws, and these new curriculums are very stringent. So they have to train their teachers, a lot of micromanagement, and this results in a lot of turnover. Usually usually of our teachers who have been teaching for a long time. They see these new systems come in. They've been in that classroom teaching for 20, 25 plus years. They don't need this. We're losing on the OGs. We're losing out on the recipes because of all of this new education reform. Now, these models, they show some initial gains, but we don't see how they affect student learning over time. Spoiler alert, they're unsuccessful. They spread like wildfire, and they leave a burning trail of teachers, parents, and school officials that feel burnt by the school system, okay? Now, remember, I told you there has to be a lot of teacher training for these new reforms, and a lot of teachers, if they're not going along with the reforms, they are either coerced out of their classroom or they're fired. And unions try to fight this, but a lot of times these new district officials and superintendents, they make the union, the teachers union, the enemy, and they try to paint the union as, oh, look at these grown-ups who are fighting all of our new changes. They don't want the kids to succeed. But no, unions protect teachers, okay? They don't harm kids. Unions are initially what protected women in the profession initially, because as we can see now, teaching is mostly a woman profession. It protected them from firing when they got married or when they got pregnant. And a lot of them helped to establish protections that later led to legislation that guards not only women, but all people in the workplace. And a lot of these new officials that are coming in with these new education reforms, they're coming from the business world, okay? And they basically have no empathy for teachers. They just want to ram in their agenda, and they don't really care who gets hurt in the process. So with this new curriculum, there's a lot of training. This costs money. This funding that was usually just going to the local school is now concentrated at the district office. Now it's kind of held out like, okay, if you don't comply, these resources are held back from schools and principals if they don't comply. Remember, this mimics the same culture from No Child Left Behind. Comply or die. The name of the game in education now becomes, what's the new latest fad? What's the new strategy? Not what are we teaching our kids? And with this new concentrated leadership and toxic culture, things and changes were implemented faster. There's no checks and balances, and the public, even though it's supposed to be public education, they're shut out from a lot of these decisions. And honestly, this idea of incentive and punishment that comes from No Child Left Behind, we're going to see how ineffective it is. But it's essentially, if you pass, we'll give you more resources to get even better. But if you fail, you need to get better or else. It's essentially a business practice, either perform or get fired. And it's crazy, like this isn't even a true concept for most business elites. Billionaires mess up and lose money all the time. They don't lose their livelihood, and even if they do lose money, it's not much compared to what they retain. But education is not a business. Government is not a business, and we shouldn't be allowing people who are good businessmen and women to work in government just because of their experience with that. These people have experience with business, not public goods and services. They're not the same. They're different. Now, because testing is now the name of the game, there continues to be a growing disparity between good and bad schools. And the efficacy of a school is hard to determine, okay? Remember, every state has different standards, and some districts change the passing standard year to year to show gains. At the same time, test scores for the local schools are being published in the papers. You see them on the nightly news, and schools start to gain a reputation, and parents and families start to take notice of this, and now enter the idea of school choice and charter schools.